Okay, it's 6 o'clock, so why don't we get started? I'll pass the mic over to Coralie to welcome us all into this virtual room.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Coralie Breen. I'm the Manager of Planning Strategic Initiatives with the CVRD. Thank you for joining us this evening. Emily Renals is joining us as a moderator for this evening's event. She's an associate with Dialogue, whom the CVRD has contracted to support upcoming engagement events for the OCP and for our local and neighborhood planning process. So welcome, Emily, and over to you.
Thanks, Coralie, and hello. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the SALTAIR Coastal Study Public Information Meeting. I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations here in Vancouver. And I want to acknowledge that the CVRD is located on the unceded territory of many nations who are Coast Salish peoples. And SALTAIR is within or near the unceded territory of the Hawalt, Penelakut, Laixin, and Chemainus First Nations. I'm joined by our presenters today. So that's Jeff Moore, Coralie, who just introduced herself, Ali Garnett, Andrea Cross, and Rick Guthrie from Andrea Cross. That list is from the CVRD. Rick Guthrie and Holly Wogard are joining us from Stantec. They are the consultants who helped prepare this study and will be present at the public open house on June 2nd at SALTAIR Community Center. I'll speak to that a little bit more in a moment. Sonny Brisky, who is the CVRD's Chief Building Inspector and a SALTAIR resident, is also on hand for questions. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items I want to speak to. Excuse me. This event is designed as a Q&A, and so you'll just be seeing the faces of our presenters and panelists tonight. But don't worry, the CVRD is hosting a second meeting in person, as I said, on June 2nd from 3 to 5 p.m. at the SALTAIR Community Center. And there you'll be able to have a face-to-face discussion with staff and consultants. And we'll post those details at the very end on a slide at the very end of tonight's event. So tonight we'll be starting off with a presentation. Let's go to slide 2 here. And that's going to cover off why the CVRD is hosting tonight's event, what we've learned through the study, and what the CVRD is doing to address the outcomes of the study. They'll also speak to what it means for you as a resident or a property owner. And we're covering some technical material today, so we've allowed time for questions throughout the presentation. To ask questions, you'll be able to use the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and just type in your question. We have a pretty full house tonight, so we prefer if you use that Q&A function, in part because it will give us a record of all the questions. And although there's a number of us who will be monitoring that question and answer slot, the district will respond to any questions we don't get to, or the CVRD staff will respond to any questions we don't get to after the event. So it's our evening, it's our weekday evening, a Monday, no less. So we're really going to aim to wrap up tonight's session at 7:30, so you can all return to your evenings. And yes, if you have any questions if you're having issues with functionality, type that into the Q&A box as well. So one final note, the outcomes of the coastal study and the amendment to Development Permit Area 7 will be changing the way the CVRD's development process unfolds, and that's really to improve the safety of folks and of development in SALTAIR. And this affects you, no doubt. And while we all express comments, questions, and concerns in this virtual space, we are agreeing to listen and to be respectful, which in this context means really assuming good intent behind anyone who speaks and making the effort to talk to each other, not about each other. Part of my role today will just be holding us all accountable to that community agreement. With that as our foundation, I'll turn it over to Jeff to get us started. And you can just prompt me through the slideshow.
Okay, thank you. If we could move on to the first, or to the next slide. So my name's Jeff Moore. I'm a senior environmental analyst in the Environmental Services Division at the CVRD. And I was the CVRD's project manager on this study to look at the slope stability within SALTAIR. I'm also lucky enough to have lived in SALTAIR for the past 12 years, and actually within the newly identified landslide hazard here up along Porter Creek. So this is very close to home, so I'm going to try to walk you through some of the technical issues, and then Coralie and some of the other folks will go through more of the planning side. So talking about why are we doing this study? Well, when we get new information about a potential hazard, then it's important that we share that information with you, whether that's through letters, meetings, online, in-person ones, this kind of thing. The coastal bluffs within SALTAIR have always been a concern. Many of you are familiar with the frequent landslides that we have in this region. And as we're going through our planning processes and updating the official community plan and modernizing it, as our understanding of hazards improves, then we update how we treat those hazards. And it also involves climate change. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. We've seen these landslides in the past, and it's likely that we're going to see more of them in the future as our climate changes. We understand a fair bit about what's coming with climate change in the region, and there's going to be more rainfall, but more importantly, the rain is going to occur in more intense storms with more rainfall all in a short period of time. And that has a number of impacts, such as flooding and an increase in the frequency of landslides, such as we've seen. So that's another reason why it's important for us to be doing this work as we look to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So what we've learned. So the CVRD hired Stantec and Palmer engineering consulting firms to do a slope stability assessment for SALTAIR. So basically what they did is they used some LiDAR to create a really detailed model of the ground surface and use this model along with historic air photos to identify where there are landslides on the landscape. And they found a couple of things. The first one was what we were expecting is shallow landslides that are small, fairly frequent on the steep slopes that we have along the coastal banks and up the ravines. These are quite common. I know of at least 2 since November, and many of you who've lived here for a while have seen them as well. And they tend to be caused by things related to water, so uncontrolled stormwater runoff and things like removal of vegetation or dumping materials onto the slopes to add more weight to them can increase the likelihood that they're going to fail. And then there's also coastal erosion, which is increasing with sea level rise. For this hazard assessment, we assume that there's going to be 1 meter of sea level rise, so there could be more erosion at the bottom of the banks as well. So that's some of the results that were found. If we can move on to the next slide. There we go, thank you. The other piece that was found in the study was a little bit unexpected, and that is that there's a pattern of these much larger retrogressive landslides, which are deep-seated landslides where it's not just the edge of the bank that slides away, but it can extend back up to 100 meters or more from the edge of the slope. And if you look at the map that's on the slide here, this is actually the LiDAR showing you the lay of the land there, and you can see the steep slopes in the ravines. And the orange lines map out all these landslides that date back over the past 500 years or so. So these are a less obvious but fairly significant hazard, and they're not something that's really front of mind to a lot of those of us who live here in SALTAIR. Most of them took place before the community was established. So these have similar causes as the shallow landslides, but it's also influenced by the underlying geology. So moving on to the next slide. With all these historic landslides that were identified, it's apparent that there's a risk of future similar slides taking place. So the next step was to identify the areas that could be affected. So Stantec and Palmer took a look at the retrogressive landslides to determine the angle that the slope ends up at after the landslide. So basically how far back it could go once everything settles, what does it look like? And then they applied that angle. So if you go from where the toe of the slope will be given sea level rise and take the angle up to where it meets the bank, there's an orange line there, and everything from the orange line to the edge of the bank is what's considered to be a landslide hazard. And then this next green line over to the side is a 15-meter safety buffer beyond that. So if we move to the next slide, we see what that looks like when you apply it on the ground. So essentially you can see the orange line sketched out along there identifies the landslide hazard from there to the edge of the steep slopes. The 15-meter buffer is the green line. So anything within the green line is where we're looking for a development permit area and some additional geotechnical study before any development takes place there, just to find out more about what's going on under the surface and what the hazard is at that specific site. If we can move on to the next slide. So the results that are available now, there's the technical slope stability assessment report is available on our website. It explains the work that was done, and it has all these maps out an area within which there's a recommendation for additional geotechnical investigation. And there's also some other recommendations in there that we'll be looking at in terms of other areas within the CVRD that have similar landscapes where there might be a similar hazard, and next steps within the SALTAIR area in terms of digging below the surface to get a better understanding of the exact extent of the hazard. And there's also some recommendations about dealing with stormwater, because that's a big cause of all this. So if we can go on to the next slide. So I'm going to be turning things over to Coralie Breen to talk about the planning aspect of this. Before I move on, if anyone has any technical questions specific to the report, I could deal with those at this point. If not, there'll be more opportunity for questions once we've gone through the remainder of the presentation.
Just a reminder, you can use the Q&A box to ask those questions. I'll pause for a little bit, allow folks to type. Okay. Alrighty, we're going to move on, but if you're in the middle of typing, keep typing, and we'll get to that question at the end. Okay, pass it to Coralie.
Thanks, Emily. As Jeff mentioned, the CVRD is in the process of modernizing the official community plan. And the next slide, please, Emily. OCPs, the official community plans, generally set out the planning and the land use designations for land within the electoral areas in the CVRD. The land use designations have things such as residential, commercial land use designations, and we also have something called development permit areas. And there are various types of development permit areas, which Ali is going to explain in a few minutes. But the one that we are addressing tonight is a development permit area for a landslide hazard. This particular development permit area already exists in our harmonized official community plan. And so the development permit area of which we're all here to learn about tonight is an amended version. This DPA 7 applies to several different electoral areas. They apply to Area E, Area H, Area F, and Area I. Those parts of the development permit area have not changed. What is new is the portion for parts of Area G and in a few slides from now, Andrea will show you the particular areas that are mapped and impacted in this designated area. Development permit areas in landslide hazards require technical reports to identify the conditions and inform the guidelines that will be required in a development permit area. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Coralie. I just see a question from Debbie, and I'm just conscious that someone might have had a hard time getting used to the Q&A format. Just before we move on, I'm wondering if we can just quickly speak to the color lines again, and then how the setback might be changing, although Andrea might be speaking to this shortly. Should we wait for Andrea to speak to it? Debbie has a question. Please, can you explain the colored lines and if the existing 15-meter setback is changing?
Yeah, maybe go back a couple slides if we can.
Sure. I'm going to have to, let's go back here. Okay. Jeff, I think this is a question for you.
Yeah, I guess it's partly to me, and there's some planning aspects to it as well in terms of the 15 meters, I believe. Right now, and Andrea will show this in the maps, the setback, or the DPA right now, the development permit area applies essentially to all the parcels along the coast right now. The new one will apply to all the area between the green line and the coast. So in some cases it won't be entire parcels, it will be part of parcels, but in some cases it will go several parcels inland. It doesn't mean, and I might look to Coralie for this, it doesn't mean that there's no development at all, that it's a complete setback, nothing happens there, but within that area it flags it that there's a possible hazard and additional geotechnical study needs to be done.
Thanks, Jeff. And just to further Debbie's question, she's also just wondering if you could give a quick overview to explain the yellow and the blue, the orange, the purple, the green lines, what those mean.
Sure. The purple is the historic landslides that are mapped out. So by looking at the detailed LiDAR and the air photos, these are the areas where there have been landscapes on the past that you can still see the remnants of that on the landscape. The blue is the coastline, assuming a meter of sea level rise. As that's where the sea level will be, assuming by sometime before 2100. Then what you've got is these yellow lines are a series of cross sections. So at each of these yellow lines, they measured that angle that I was talking about, the Farbrochung angle that is the basically tells you how far back from the slope that the hazard could extend along each of those yellow lines. And that gives you the orange line if you connect the dots along there. That's the extent of the possible landslide hazard. And then the green line gives a 15-meter buffer beyond that as a safety factor for identifying the area that will be looked at for development permit area.
Thanks, Jeff. Pass back to Coralie, or perhaps Andrea can go on and explain the way the DPA is changing just shortly. We will hold that question a little bit. Okay, go back to what is a development permit?
Thanks very much, Emily. Hi, I'm Ali Garnett. I'm a planner with the Planning Strategic Initiatives Division of the CVRD, and I will try to address the question, what is a development permit? So as Coralie explained, an OCP can designate land as a development permit area for several reasons. For example, for the protection of the natural environment, its ecosystems and biological diversity, or for the protection of development from hazardous conditions. And the OCP will do this by both describing it in language and illustrating it in map. A development permit area describes the special conditions or objectives that justify the designation, and it will include guidelines for how the special conditions or objectives can be addressed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when is a development permit needed? It is needed prior to undertaking subdivision, construction, addition or alteration of a building or other structure, or the alteration of land. And when a development permit is required in a hazard area, a geotechnical report is required. Thanks, Emily. So if a geotechnical report is required, the landowner must have the report prepared by an experienced professional engineer or geoscientist. The report should confirm that the land can be used safely for the intended use, and the report will include restrictions, conditions, or limitations on the proposed development. Now, this slide is meant to explain the structure of the official community plan to better understand the amendment bylaw 4427 that we're here to consider tonight. So the official community plan bylaw 4270, which is the OCP for the electoral areas, including SALTAIR, it contains many different schedules. Schedule C includes the development permit area guidelines and includes the links to the technical reports that were referenced earlier. Schedule U includes the mapping of the development permit areas. And Andrea will speak to that, to those map changes in just a minute. So Bylaw 4427 proposes to add 6 new guidelines to the existing landslide hazard development permit area guidelines. So I won't read out everything that's on the slide, but for example, the first guideline states that driveway and surface runoff should not be directed toward the crest of the bluff, but rather be directed through drains or pipes to the bottom of a bluff or to an area identified by a professional. And now I'll pass it over to Andrea to explain the proposed mapping changes.
Thank you, Allison. Yeah, good. So this map shows the difference between the old data and the new data. The current OCP is on the left-hand side. As you can see, Jeff had mentioned that the landslide hazard was based on the SALTAIR, the parcels that are on the SALTAIR bluffs, and that's what we see highlighted in red here. So this slide is an excerpt from map UDPA 7.2 for landslide hazards. I'll just briefly say that the maps are named first by the schedule letter. So U there indicates that this is a map that is part of Schedule U, which is the development permit area maps. The DPA 7 portion of it indicates that this is DPA 7 for landslide hazards. And the 0.2 means that this is the second map in this DPA. So map UDPA 7.2 in this case shows electoral area G. And this is the SALTAIR portion of that map, a close-up of that. So as we said, the map on the left shows the landslide hazard which applied to the parcels on the SALTAIR bluffs along the coastline. And if a parcel was on the coast, the entire parcel was included in the DPA. And where the DPA appears to go inland on this map, it's just because it's a large or long coastal parcel. On the right-hand side, we see the landslide hazard data has been replaced by the data from the 2022 Coastal Slope Stability Assessment SALTAIR study by Stantec and Palmer that Jeff was presenting earlier. And this data extends from the coast to the study's calculated setback plus 15 meters, which was that green line in the study in the earlier slides. Next slide, please. So the new landslide hazard DPA data covers more land than just the coastal SALTAIR bluff parcels. And that's partly because there are a couple of inland ravine areas in SALTAIR. just south of Davis Lagoon. You can see that there's a ravine that surrounds Stocking Lake along the Stocking Creek Park there. And also in the south along Olson and Oyster Way roads, there's a ravine that surrounds Porter Creek. So the coastal slope stability assessment study found that lands along these ravines are potential landslide hazards in addition to the SALTAIR bluff parcels along the coastline. And so they're included in the study and they're also included in the DPA. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some examples of where the landslide hazard would apply in relationship to a particular parcel. In the first example on the left, we see that a parcel falls outside of DPA 7. It's beyond that calculated setback plus 15 meters. So in this case, a development permit application is not required for DPA 7 for that parcel. In the middle example, the parcel falls completely within DPA 7. So in this case, a development permit application is required for DPA 7 for that parcel. And then on the last example, the parcel is partially within DPA 7. And in this case, a development permit application might be required for DPA 7. And in that case, you should speak with your planner about the details of that. Next slide, please. So as Ali mentioned, there are many different schedules within the OCP, and one of the other schedules that we'll just briefly touch on is Schedule O, which is the dam assessment flood hazard area. It includes the flood hazards. So this is just a comparison of that flood hazard data with our UDPA 7.2 landslide hazard data from Schedule U. These are just overlaid for comparison here. And in this case, we're looking at the Stocking Lake Dam Assessment Flood Hazard Area from Schedule O of the OCP. And you can see that the flood hazard area is along Stocking Creek, along in the ravine and landslide area, and it goes all the way to Davis Lagoon in the north. There's the little bit in the middle that is white is just because that's in the town of Ladysmith, and none of the OCP applies to the town of Ladysmith. So as we've seen, DPAs designate lands for uses including hazard areas, and lands within the DPA require a development permit application. For Schedule O is designating flood hazard areas, but in these cases, in these areas, it doesn't indicate a development permit application. In these areas, it's just an indication for the building inspector where they may wish to request a geotechnical report at their discretion. And now I'll pass the presentation back to Ms. Garnett.
Thanks, Andrea. So now a little bit of what this means for you. I just have a brief slide to explain sort of the process of building in a development permit area. So you will need an approved development permit for building in a development permit area prior to applying for a building permit. Once a building permit has been issued, the recommendations of the geotechnical report and the development permit conditions have to be followed, and a covenant may be required as a part of the development permit process. And next slide, please, Emily.